Hey everyone, welcome to the Pope Francis Generation. Welcome to Paul and our special guest, Bernard Prusak. Good to have you with us, gents.
Glad to be here.
So, Paul, today's topic, can you share it and why?
Yeah, so today we're going to be talking with Dr. Prusak about an up-and-coming article he has being published on institutional vice and how that relates to abuse and scandal within the Catholic Church. He sent it to me a month or two ago, and I thought it was really excellent. So I wanted to discuss that topic with him here.
Wonderful. All right, let's get into all of this, because that's a question I've had for a while about when we're talking about structures of sin and so on. What's the level of responsibility that individuals have towards that sort of thing? And I skimmed through the post just the other day, and so I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, friends, welcome to the Pope Francis Generation. It's the show for Catholics struggling with the Church's teaching, who feel like they might not belong in the Church anymore, and who still hunger for a God of love and goodness.
Your hosts are me, Paul Fahey, a professional catechist.
And I'm Dominic, someone who needs catechesis. Together we're taking our own look at the Catholic Church, her teachings and practices from three views that changed our world.
And those are the Kerygma, the Doctrine of Theosis, and the teachings of Pope Francis.
Together with you, we're the Pope Francis Generation. Over to you, Paul.
Yeah, so we have Dr. Prusak with us. He holds the Raymond and Eleanor Smiley Chair in Business Ethics at John Carroll University. He was formerly the professor of philosophy and director of the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at King's College in Pennsylvania. His books include Catholic Moral Philosophy in Practice and Theory and Catholic Higher Education and Catholic Social Thought. Bernard, thank you again for coming on.
Glad to be here. Let me just note, though, that latter book, Catholic Higher Education and Catholic Social Thought, is co-edited with Jennifer Reed Booley, so I just want to give her a shout-out.
Excellent. So I first came across your work, like a couple of months ago. Sister Teresa Alethea sent me an article that you had written for Commonweal about the McCarrick report that you had written, I think, a couple of years ago. And I liked that quite a bit. And when I read it, I had the sense that you understood the abuse scandal within the Church differently than many people who I encounter. Often when I have this discussion or read people talking about this issue, abuse within the Church is talked about as like a few bad apples, as isolated individuals. But you seem to understand, when I was reading this article, the systemic nature of it and the institutional nature of it. And I reached out to you on the hunch that was the case. And you sent me this up-and-coming article that you have coming out by, was it by Liturgical Press?
It's an article in a book that's edited by several colleagues from Liturgical Press. I'm not sure that the book has a title quite yet.
Okay.
It's a book coming out of a conference that was held last November and December.
Yeah, and that was specifically about institutional vice as it relates to the abuse scandal within the Church.
Not the conference. The conference was about, looking here at the program from the conference, The Legacy and Limits of Vatican II in an Age of Crisis. It was hosted by Massimo Fagioli at Villanova. A few of the papers in the book will have to do with the sexual abuse crisis in one way or the other. Mine's, I think, the one paper that looks at it through the lens of institutional vice.
Yeah. Before we jump in, I wanted to ask and get to know you a little bit. You're a professor of philosophy and ethics. How does someone choose to end up in a vocation like that? And then a little bit more specifically, how do you move from that to talking about the abuse scandal within the Church?
Well, I just had my 51st birthday, so there's a long answer to the question of how one gets to where I happen to be at the moment. Long and winding. To simplify for sure, I'm the son of a theologian, so another academic, and that for sure is an important part of my background. Both my parents have deep roots in the Church, so a concern for the church, a love for the church, sometimes a frustration for the church, were present in my childhood, active in my childhood. After college, I had really the great fortune and privilege of making the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela. I had a Watson Fellowship from the Thomas J. Watson Foundation, rather. And that was a really formative experience for me, for my own faith life. I worked then for Commonweal magazine for a year. This is still before the millennium. And that too was a wonderful year in all kinds of ways. And began my relationship with the magazine. I've been writing for Commonweal for 25 plus years. That's some of the writing I like most to do. I enjoy academic writing and publishing books, but I really like writing for that more general interest, very intelligent audience. That's been important to me. So yeah, that's some of how I got to be a professor of philosophy. There's some leaps and jumps there. If you're going to be in this business, you need some perseverance, and you also need patience and luck. The politics and the luck need to cut your way. I was able to teach at Boston University, which is where I did my PhD for a few years, which was a wonderful transition from student to faculty. After we had our first child, my wife and I moved to Villanova, where my parents were at that time, and I worked there for a while. And then I moved on to King's to found the Ethics Center, which was great work, and I really am grateful for my time at King's. I've been at John Carroll only one semester. This is my second semester, about to begin for me tomorrow. So far, so good. It's a little bit different for me to be in a business school. I've taught business ethics for a number of years, but this is my first time in a business school proper rather than a philosophy department. How I got to thinking about sexual abuse scandal is another difficult question. It's not going to be easy for me to put my finger on just how I got to it. I have a couple interests, though, maybe philosophical interests that brought me to it. So I'm interested in what's called epistemic injustice. So epistemic, from the Greek word for knowledge. So an epistemic injustice is a wrong that you do to somebody in his or her capacity as a knower. Miranda Fricker wrote a great book entitled Epistemic Injustice, really wonderful read. And I've been thinking about that for a while. Now, the sexual abuse scandal is twofold, right? There's the scandal of priests and religious abusing children and other vulnerable people. And then there's also the scandal of how the knowledge of that initial scandal was managed. And my focus has been that latter scandal. So looking at how knowledge circulates in the church, how knowledge is blocked, how knowledge is generated, and looking in particular at various forms of epistemic injustice that have been at work within the sexual abuse scandals. That Commonweal article that I published a year or two ago, can't remember, has to do primarily with epistemic injustice, considering the economy of knowledge in the church, but then focusing in particular on wrongs done to people as knowers, to children, and again, other vulnerable people in various ways. We're all vulnerable in various ways, but there are some vulnerabilities that make people easier prey within the church.
Yeah.
So that was one interest. Let me just say a second. So I'm also interested, though, more generally in so-called distortions of normativity. So really when morality goes bad. And I've been fascinated for some years in questions of conscience, but in particular when our conscience misleads us, when our conscience is badly formed. And, questions of conscience also figure within the sexual abuse scandal. So that's another philosophical interest of mine. I could speak more about personal interests too that brought me, but those are the two philosophical interests that led me to think some more about the scandal.
Yeah. So I'm in my final semester getting a master's degree in professional counseling, and that's kind of the sphere that I have existed in for a while, but that I also see the world through. So when I hear epistemic injustice and injustice against people's knowing, like my mind goes to things like deceit and manipulation and gaslighting and things like that. Is that on the right track, or what? Yeah, what are examples of that?
Yeah, gaslighting could be an extreme example of so-called hermeneutical violence, right? So, hermeneutics just has to do with interpretation. So the gaslighter systematically misinterprets for the person who's being gaslit his or her experiences. So gaslighting for sure is a form of so-called epistemic injustice. Another common form is so-called testimonial injustice. So when you discount or deflate credibility of somebody's testimony due to systematic prejudices that you have about that person, given various characteristics that the person exhibits. So child, woman, race, so sexism enters, racism enters. A subtler form of epistemic injustice is what Grand Miranda Fricker, calls hermeneutical injustice. And this typically isn't perpetrated by anybody. So if I'm guilty of testimonial injustice, and for sure I have been, if I discount the credibility of somebody's testimony on the basis of prejudices that I have, well, I did that. Hermeneutical injustice is a little different. That's when resources for interpreting experience are either lacking or distorting of people's experience. So an example that Fricker gives in her book is of, well, there are a few examples, but one she draws here from Edmund White, Boy's Story, if I'm recalling the name of the title of the novel. So what was it to grow up gay in, let's say, 1950s America, in a particular socioeconomic context? Well, there were resources for you to understand yourself, but they were resources that systematically distorted your self-understanding. Sometimes the resources might not be available at all. So let's say that, again, an example from Fricker, there's no concept of sexual harassment in the society in which you live. What do you make of what these men keep doing to you? There's no word quite for it. You can't interpret it. You can't put your finger on it. And you can't say, you're harassing me sexually and it's wrong. You should stop. Or if there's no concept for postpartum depression, how do you make sense of what it is that you're going through? I think, Paul, you're aware of the work of Michelle Panchuk, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing, so apologies to her, but she's done some really interesting.
Yeah, research on spiritual abuse.
Yeah, and spiritual abuse. And she has a paper on distorting concepts, obscured experiences, where she's really working with this concept of hermeneutical injustice.
Yeah. The things that come to mind for me are because some of the work that I want to do in the future, integrating mental health practices within church spaces and ministry spheres, is I'm continually shocked. Like within mental health spheres, there's such an emphasis on. Am I back now?
You're back.
Yeah, you're back now. So we'll just find that out afterwards.
My internet totally went down, and I have no idea what happened. So we'll go from there.
I don't know what you're saying though. In your practice.
Oh, yeah. So in thinking about the work I want to do as a mental health professional within church spaces and ministry spaces, something that I'm noticing more and more is in my own formation as a mental health professional, there's an emphasis on power dynamics and the power imbalance between therapist and client, and the responsibility as a therapist that comes with that power imbalance. And then looking in church spaces and ministry spaces and pastoral counseling spaces, and how very rarely is there any understanding of power imbalances at all in those situations, where to me that seems like there isn't even a epistemic framework for understanding power dynamics when it relates to pastoral care. So that's what comes to mind when.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I can't speak to that claim. It doesn't surprise me, but yeah, I mean, what has the sexual abuse scandal been about? Well, I mean, it's about a lot, but in both aspects, it's been about power, right? So abuse of power by abusers, and then likewise, we have to consider quite seriously the power of knowledge, how knowledge has circulated, how knowledge has been stymied, how knowledge has been blocked, how it's not been formed, how people haven't really wanted to know in full.
Yeah.
To say about that. I hesitated to say abuse of power with respect to the second scandal, and no doubt, there's been some simple, straightforward abuse, but I think I'm more interested. I'm not so interested in cases where somebody's just been terrible and evil and so on and so forth. And maybe there have been cases like that, for sure. But coming at the sexual abuse scandal like that, I think can obscure the institutional or organizational dimensions. That it's not only and always that evil people have done evil things. Evil people have done evil things. But if that's our only lens, I don't think we're really going to understand just why this scandal was able to take on the dimensions that it did.
Yeah, and that was the aspect of your article on institutional vice that really captured me. So to move there, what is institutional vice as a concept, and then how does that relate to? You've talked about two scandals. The first being the actual abuse of people, and the second being the scandal of the systemic cover-up of that, or misinformation of that. So how does this institutional vice relate to specifically that second scandal?
So again, Miranda Fricker has done some interesting writing on this question, and once more, I'm indebted to her. Feminist philosophers have done a lot of really interesting work in thinking about power dynamics of knowledge. So when you're talking about an institutional vice, I think the first key point to make is that it can't be understood simply as all the vices of all the people who happen to belong to the institution, right? So we're not going to give a so-called summative account. Instead, if the concept of institutional vice makes sense, then we're talking about a vice of the institution as a whole. So a vice in which people are habituated, vice that people come to perpetrate by virtue of belonging to the institution, qua member of the institution, this or that office of the institution, this or that role within the institution. So the basic idea is that by virtue of belonging to an institution, a so-called plural subject that can say we in a distinctive way, individuals can develop vices that they didn't bring to work, so to speak, right? So it's not, I brought a vice to work and you brought a vice to work, and lo and behold, look at all these vices our institution has. No, you want to think about belonging to the institution as an important part of the story of how individuals came to perpetrate these various wrongs.
So is it too simplistic to say that an institution at its best is virtuous in that it would help me be more virtuous just by my participation in the institution, and that institutional vice is the flip side of that, and that is that it would encourage me to act more poorly simply because I participate in the institution?
I don't know if that's too simplistic. I mean, we'd like to think that belonging to some institutions like the church, right, might enable us to develop virtues that we could have difficulty developing independently of belonging to this or that organization or community or institution. So I think there's something to that. Sure, likewise, the claim is that people might not develop these or those vices. People might not have these bad habits, these habitual ways of missing the mark, should they not belong, should they not have come to belong to the institution. So institutions can inculcate in members forms of vice that they, again, don't bring the work, so to speak, they develop through belonging to that institution.
So yeah, how does that relate to then your research into the abuse scandal within the church?
Well, again, I'm going to say this isn't the only lens, but it's one lens. I know, Paul, you're interested in lenses of having to do with social sin or structures of sin, and I think that's another way you can come at this question. In fact, overlapping approach to some extent. So what I do in that paper, which isn't that long a paper, is I look again at the McCarrick report, draw a little bit from what's the Dublin report's name? Escaping me at the moment. But there's so much literature. I draw as well from the recent French report, the Murphy reports, the Dublin report. So I try to consider what, to begin with, I try to consider what vices there might be in evidence. I also developed there, drawing from the philosopher Margaret Gilbert, a means of understanding how it is that people might come to act qua members of an institution. And there the key concept is the formation of a so-called plural subject, so a subject that can say we in this distinctive way. A key mechanism is really quite simple. So how do you become a plural subject? Well, you've got a joint commitment to this or that undertaking or end or activity, whatever it might be. Could be this podcast, for that matter. You jointly undertake this podcast, and you make various decisions as the producers of this podcast. And you, Paul, might disagree with that decision, but you've made that decision qua producer of the podcast. And so now you're going to say, well, this is what we think as producers of the podcast, let's say. So you become one of us, right, when you're part of a plural subject. And you become then subject to the constraints that the people who belong to that plural subject have made qua members of that plural subject. So you can say, we think this, we hold that, even though individuals might not think this or hold that. But as members of this plural subject, you do hold that. Anyway, members of plural subjects can come to have views, beliefs even, that individuals might themselves question. They can also develop ways that they think they ought to conduct themselves in particular sets and circumstances. So could be very formal. You could have a vote, we think this or that, and now everybody's going to go along with that since that's the view of the group. Or you could develop these views, beliefs tacitly, simply by going along with practices that other people who belong to that group have set in place. That's really key. This going along with, this letting pass, is a way that vices can become institutionalized. So this is the way we're supposed to respond. This is what we respond. If you accommodate, that view or that behavior, that practice, that becomes part of what is expected of you as a member of that group. And if you act differently, then you owe some kind of account to members of that group because you were supposed to act as one of us. I think if you look at Murphy report, McCarrick report, so much documentation, I think you'll see that quite common dynamic at play. So this is the way we're supposed to respond. People respond the way they're expected. They wink, they nod, they move on. In the paper, I discussed this one incident with McCarrick at a Newark catering hall in 1990. I discuss it too in my Commonweal article. It's really a stunning case. So 3 priests, two bishops among those priests, witnessed McCarrick fingering the crotch of a young cleric. This is 1990. What do you think they'd do? I mean, you might think they'd say, "What are you doing? Stop that." And, be outraged. And that would have been the end of McCarrick. His shenanigans would have been exposed then and there. But no, they get up and abruptly leave the table and drive back to New Jersey and talk a little bit about it in the car. One of the bishops says to the priest, McCarrick, he just does things a little bit differently, so on and so forth. Well, that's bizarre. Now, the fact that they got up and abruptly left the table suggests they didn't think that what McCarrick was up to was all right. It's not like they personally thought that was acceptable. But they didn't challenge him, right? Instead, they reacted, apparently, the way they thought they were supposed to act, right? So the default uptake was quickly look away and say very little, right? And that's how somebody like McCarrick was able to behave in the ways that he did over decades, really. And you see a lot of cases like that. I think we can talk about that as institutional vice. We're not going to talk about it as vices those individuals brought to work, so to speak. Clearly, individually, they didn't think this was all right. But for some reason or other, this is the way they reacted, qua members of the body. This was the way one acted. One let this pass. And I think you can see several institutional vices here, all epistemic. There's a kind of willful ignorance. We don't want to know too much, right? Quickly looking away. There's what's called an inferential inertia. So you don't take the logical next steps. You don't draw the inferences that you should be drawing. And you see that again and again in the Murphy report. And then there's an accommodation of untruth too. He's just a little different. So you tell a little story, tell a little fiction that allows you to be charitable, toward the figure in question. I talked about this case a little bit with Sister Teresa Alethea, and she made a good point, which has made it into a revision of my paper. This is my terminology, but it's basically her point that each of these vices is keyed to a counterfeit good, so keyed to a false virtue. This is the way I think makes sense generally. I think about vices. Often what we're pursuing when we're in the grip of a vice is a counterfeit good. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, it's even that pursuit is disguised by a false virtue. So simplest case, just give that one last example with the combination of untruths. That could be keyed to the counterfeit good of preserving somebody's reputation or thinking the best of someone, and the counterfeit or the false virtue there would be a virtue of charity. So I think in every case too, if you wanted to push the analysis a little deeper, you could look at these various epistemic vices, and you could see that they were often in the pursuit of counterfeit goods. And this goes hand in hand with my interest in that distortions of normativity, right? When morality goes bad. We're masters of self-deception and rationalization, and you know this well from your training in counseling, I'm sure.
Yeah. There's a few things that come to mind. One is, and I've talked about this in conversations on this podcast several times, where I worked as a catechist for many years at a parish. That was my full-time job. And I recognized very clearly that when I was teaching as a catechist, that I have views and opinions and emphases on theological things that are my own. But when I'm teaching someone as a catechist, I'm teaching someone as a representative of the church and not as, Paul. And so, yeah, I instinctively understand that idea of a we identity.
Yeah, that's a good example.
But then also thinking about how there's spoken behavior, which, like, as a catechist, there's the spoken expectation that I'm not presenting my personal ideas as if they were church teaching. That's an explicit expectation. But there are implicit expectations, like you were saying, that are unspoken. Man, I can think of that a lot in families. We don't talk about this person. We don't bring this subject up. We don't, and that's, no one's ever told that. You just know that by being a part of the family. Or I think of that in other parish dynamics where it's like, yeah, Father's a little quirky, so we don't send these cases to Father. We don't bother him with these things because we know he doesn't respond well to those things. But I'm thinking, because you talked about how these institutional vices are wanting to get at something good, wanting to get at a virtue, and it's a distortion of it. And I wonder how much, the thought that comes to my mind is, how much of it is this implicit desire and like need to belong and not wanting to rock the boat, where like there's all of these unspoken expectations for this is how you belong in this institution, in this community, in this family, and you don't violate those norms because that threatens your belonging.
Yeah, no, I think that's insightful. The more you go along with the winking, the more you go along with this or that view or behavior to which you might personally object, the stronger the pressure is to keep going along, right?
Yeah.
It's a kind of so-called normative pressure, right? It's like a moral rule, whether it's moral or immoral. But this is the way that we're supposed to conduct ourselves. This is what you're supposed to do. So the costs go higher and higher the more you go along with it. The cost of disidentification with the group. And I think that is part of the dynamic here anyway.
And I think of an institution like the church, especially when you're talking about, as a lay minister in the church, I didn't see my job just as a job. I saw my ministry work as a vocation, as a part of my identity, and to use like theological language, as a part of my sacramental identity, as a part of my living out my baptism, and that put more pressure on needing to be a good piece of the institution, a good member of the body, a good part of the group. But I see that pressure grows when I see lay people working higher up in the institution, working at a diocesan level, for example, or more so even for clerics, where even more of their personal identity is ramped up into belonging and being a good player in the institution, where you have people who personally, individually, wouldn't accept these behaviors, but now within this context are accepting these really terrible behaviors because of how belonging is wrapped up in their identity. I don't know. Am I kind of rambling on, or is that?
No, I think that's right. Somebody, and you probably know her work, who's done really important work on thinking about the organizational or systemic dimensions of the sexual abuse scandal, is Marie Keenan, in her book titled, which escapes me. Give me one sec. I think it's just Child Sexual Abuse in the Catholic Church. She published with Oxford a decade ago at this point. And she makes that point that you were making about priests, that sometimes, and I don't claim expertise here, I'm just drawing from Keenan, sometimes a priest might not have an identity apart from that role of being a priest, right? And disidentification then with the institution is nearly unthinkable if that's the case. If your identity is so bound up with that role, so you can see how speaking up and breaking from the group, breaking from that plural subject, it might be very, very painful, right? I draw on my paper from some discussions I had with Father Ken Lash, who's a priest from the Diocese of Paterson, And he was a very early and vocal advocate for abuse victims and survivors. Father Lash really was basically exiled by other priests of the diocese. Bishop called him a Judas. One priest wondered whether he'd been overcome with Satan, so on and so forth. They just wouldn't talk to him. 98%, he'd say, of his colleagues just walked away from him. And that's because he broke from us, right? He acted in a way that one of us was not supposed to act. And there was great pressure on him to keep his mouth shut, as he put it. Great pressure over decades, for that matter. And you could see then why someone might be reluctant to break that pattern, right? Why someone might simply go along, might simply wink, accommodate the untruth, look away, don't dig any deeper than need be, and might disguise those various institutional vices in the form of various false virtues, pursuing counterfeit goods. And there are people who did break away, like Father Lash isn't the only one, right, by any means. I think there are people who probably were corrupted, right, who saw bad happening and simply looked away by virtue of belonging to the institution. And probably, no doubt, there are a lot of people who really struggled with what to do and what to say.
Yeah. I'm kind of conceptualizing as you're talking about this institutional vice is this environment, this atmosphere that puts up obstacles to knowing the truth and doing the good. It both obscures, knowledge that something's wrong in the first place. It prevents you from having a wider context to realize that type of behavior is not healthy. That type of behavior is harmful. But then it also puts up obstacles for you doing the good. And it actually creates like a current, like a river current of moving in a direction where it actually takes effort to move against it. And the default is to keep going with whatever this culture is. Is that a good way of explaining it?
Yeah, and I think that's well put. Yeah, the default uptake becomes simply to go along, to wink. It's Michael Papesh, I don't know how to pronounce his name, wrote a really good piece in America, looking for my citation of it. But that's his terminology of winking. So, title of his article, again, published in America, I think it's like Farewell to the Club. When he was ordained, the bishop jokes now he's a member of the club. And he talks about the dynamics belonging to this club, this group, this plural subject. And you learned very early, according to the author, that what you're supposed to do is to wink at sexual misdeeds. So don't look too long, and also give a knowing nod, knowing wink, but then on you go. That was a condition of membership in the group. Yeah.
So that makes me think of, and you mentioned this earlier, we've talked about this a little bit before, how institutional vice overlaps with the idea of structures of sin within the church. Just for listeners to share what structures of sin is, this is from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. The Church says, the consequences of sin perpetuate structures of sin. These are rooted in personal sin, and therefore are also connected to concrete acts of the individuals who commit them, consolidate them, and make it difficult to remove them. It is thus that they grow stronger, spread, and become sources of other sins, conditioning human conduct. These are obstacles and conditioning that go well beyond the actions and brief lifespan of the individual. In the reading I've done about this, the church makes distinctions between personal sin, cultures of sin, and institutional sin, and connects all of them together. And then it proposes that the virtue of solidarity is the counter, is the solution to this. And it talks about solidarity as both a personal virtue that allows me to see my co-responsibility with other people, that they are a part of my family. They are my brothers and sisters. They have value apart from their use for me. And it's a social virtue that moves me to work to dismantle these structures of sin. So in some of the church's writings on racism, for example, it brings out these categories to talk about racism as a structure of sin. And I think the newer language that we have in society around racism is helpful, where if there's this current of racism, this culture of racism, then being neutral isn't sufficient. Being not a racist myself isn't sufficient, because if I'm just standing still, I'm going along with the current still, that I actually have an obligation out of solidarity to be anti-racist, to be making an effort to not just break down the structures of sin, of racism within me, but also within the circles, the societies that I have any influence over. How does this overlap with this idea of institutional vice? I intuitively see some overlap, but then I also possibly see like a solution. Is solidarity an answer to how to overcome institutional vice?
So, I'm not sure about the latter. Overlap for sure. I actually looked at an article by Dan Finn, published a piece in Commonweal in 2018 on understanding sinful social structures, and had a longer piece in Theological Studies in 2016. And I think that's a helpful piece. When I hear the compendium text, I'd want to hear more about this claim that the roots of social sin are personal sin. So for sure, in a sense, I mean, institutions themselves don't sin. Institutions themselves don't perpetrate acts of violence. It's the people who belong to the society or the institution. So, I mean, that's just a given. I think where I'm pressing, and again, drawing here from the work of Miranda Fricker, is to think about social structures, right, and institutional dynamics and habits as predating, right, pre-existing the people who then come to occupy those positions. Finn draws from what he calls critical realist sociology, and makes this one nice point that an insight into structures is that the majority of actors are the dead. They're the people who helped form these various structures within which then we have our agency. Our agency is restricted by these structures. There are also various opportunities that the structures afford people. As for solidarity, I'm not sure if that's the answer to these institutional vices or these sinful structures. And I don't want to disparage the virtue of solidarity by any means. Fricker's work on epistemic justice is really interesting in this one regard. She thinks that we should spend a little bit more time thinking about various forms injustice can take, various forms wrongs can take. So that's where to begin. So we're not going to develop first and foremost our theory of justice and then think about how that might be brought into being, might be applied, so to speak. We're going to look instead at various forms of injustice, and then that might give us insight into the particular forms of virtue that we might need to develop. So what might be a virtue of testimonial justice? What sorts of virtues does hermeneutic injustice require us to develop? So I suppose that's where I'd want to begin here too. So what sorts of virtues do these various epistemic institutional vices in evidence in the sexual abuse scandal call us to develop? So how do we respond to these overlapping vices, the inferential inertia, the willful ignorance, the accommodation of untruths. Solidarity might be part of the answer, but I think the answer probably needs to be more fine-grained than that. I'm not sure what the answers are, what would be the corresponding virtues that we need to develop. Another interesting claim, this is developed by the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson. Shouldn't say much about it, but a little critique of Fricker's book. Anderson suggests that the responses to these various forms of epistemic injustice have to be institutional themselves. We can't rely only on individuals to develop these forms of justice. Let me give just a quick example. So let's say that I've got various systemic prejudices against these or those people. I've got different stereotypes, and the upshot is that I deflate the credibility of claims that they make. I might become aware of some of those prejudices that I have, and perhaps I can, readjust, the credibility that I accord then to, these are those people. But it also could be really hard for me to become aware of, after all, of the prejudices that I have, right?
Yeah.
And so the responses might need to be, more systemic or institutional. We might need to look to institutions rather than simply rely on individuals. And I'd have to say a lot more about that, make it a lot more concrete. But I suppose that's why I wonder whether the virtue of solidarity is the answer. And I have that same question when it comes to anti-racist efforts. I mean, for sure, solidarity is part of the answer. But I would wonder, looking at Catholic social teaching, whether racism, a response to racism, doesn't call for maybe much more specific particular virtues for which we don't yet have good names. I'm not sure about that, but that's my hunch anyway.
Yeah. I'm thinking about something you said is you think that the response to institutional vice at some point there needs to be an institutional response, not just individual responses. I see that again, thinking about racism in the United States and the ways that civil rights laws were themselves teachers. They helped change the culture so that people were no longer had those blinders in the first place, right? There's a sense where the institutional change then helped remove some of those obstacles to knowing what's true and doing what's good. But as a individual, I think of I think of an organization as vast as the Catholic Church. I want to feel like I'm doing something good to fix the problem. But if the solutions have to be institutional, especially in an institution like the church that is very hierarchical and very vertical in formation and decision making, how do I, as a lay Catholic, help change the institution in a positive way? Just solve all the problems here.
If only. You did articulate the challenge well, right? Well, this is maybe part of the frustrations of your listeners, right? Of the Pope Francis generation. And we've looked to Francis for change, and he's brought about change slowly, right? Within the limits of the institution within which he's operating. He's had to be quite cagey. I think an interesting analysis of Francis as Machiavellian probably, could be written. And I don't know that, to suggest he's manipulative and willing to use, bad ends to good means. I mean, instead that he's a, cagey political actor and, is well aware of the limits within which he can operate. What can we do, though, individually? Well, belong to good and vibrant parishes, right? support communities and priests where lay people have really important leadership roles, right? Where it's not all fathers knows best. Resist as well those dynamics. And those power dynamics within the church manifest in all kinds of ways, obvious and really quite subtle sometimes too. We want to, I have friends who are priests, right? So, by no means do I want to put down the priesthood or paint with an unfairly broad brush by any means. But, these clericalist, hierarchicalist structures that have played important roles within sexual abuse scandal, need to be called out and challenged, right? And named as unacceptable. At the same time, you don't want to rip down the institution, right? Institution plays a really important role in people's lives. We talked about institutional vice, but at the very beginning or toward the beginning of our conversation too, you suggested there are institutional virtues, right? Virtues people can come to develop by virtue of belonging to an institution, and certainly that's how we think about the church. So I don't have easy answers to your question, Paul. Minute acts of resistance, though, I can picture one, are important, but also an awareness of our own complicity, of our own sinfulness too. I think we need to be really careful, not to picture ourselves as the heroes in every which way. Now, I'm speaking for myself here, though I was using the first person plural.
Yeah, I think about thinking about Pope Francis and this time in the church, and my experience specifically, my understanding of synodality and my experience of synodality at different levels that I participated in it. And if at the heart of synodality is this idea of co-responsibility, which I think it is co-responsibility between the vertical hierarchy and lay people. On paper, I'm like, that would be a huge step. I would love a church that is structured more in a synodal way at the parish level, at the diocesan level, at the Vatican level, all the way through. To me, that seems like if that happens, then there's more avenues for institutional change than there are now, because a vertical hierarchy that's closed off to accountability, you have to have a good monarch in order for there to be any change. There really isn't accountability from the outside, but synodality provides, at least in theory, more opportunities for accountability with the institution. However, I've also experienced this co-opting of co-responsibility, where, without getting into too many details, where co-responsibility for me as a layperson, specifically as a lay employee, was presented to me as like, look, you can be co-responsible. You can participate in leadership and in governance in some way by being co-responsible with your pastor. I'm like, that's great. I'd love that. But really what that meant in reality was, hey, we know that your pastor's not going to do what he's supposed to do, so you're responsible to make sure it still gets done. To where the authority was not shared, but the burden was. But the language of co-responsibility was still used, but co-opted. And even in Francis's his own pontificate, where there's areas where it seems like he's very synodal, and areas where it seems like he still exercises his like unilateral power that he has, his authority within the church. So yeah, I guess, what has been your assessment of synodality? What's your reactions to some of that? And do you see hope in those structures changing, maybe to have more accountability for institutional change?
Well, let me say I want to be hopeful. And I admire people who really are hopeful. So thinking of my colleague at LaSalle, Maureen O'Connell, who's been very involved with discerning deacons and is a real advocate for synodality, and I think really played an important part in the Philadelphia Archdiocese. I have not, so I kind of want to stay there, because there are people who are very hopeful about it, and people who really think that this is a moment of possibility. And I think I'd prefer to give people like that the floor at this point. Let those voices be amplified. I suppose I'd just observe too, there's going to be so much change in our church, right? No matter what we do, in some ways, over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years, right? I mean, who knows, what the next papacy will bring, right? But we know that the structures of our parishes will change. They're going to. There will not be as many priests by any means, right? We know that our colleges and universities will change. I'm at a Jesuit institution. I think we have 2 Jesuits who teach here now, and they're both probably around 70 or so. So the church really is changing. How to guide that change, how to orient that change, how to make it so that it's for the better. Well, yeah, those are really big, deep questions. How as well to accompany young people so that they'll want to participate within the church. Another really difficult question, right? So there's on the one hand, there's the question, how can we change the church? And I suppose I'm saying, yeah, that's really important, but also, wow, it's going to change. And who's going to be there to guide that change? And how do you put yourself in a position so that you might be able to participate? I'm thinking my own parish, wonderful parish, we just joined here in suburban Cleveland. How long will the priest who's the pastor be there? And, what does that parish then look like in 10 years, let's say 5 years, 10 years, I hope 10 years. So what are the new structures? Now, I mean, you can perhaps, bring priests from overseas, and maybe we'll see more and more and more priests, but there's a limit to that for sure. As we know, there are younger priests from the U.S. do tend to be more, I'll call it conservative. That's going to be difficult, I think. How that's going to play out, I'm not entirely sure. So I think synodality, comes at this, Francis's emphasis on synodality comes at a moment that is going to bring about change no matter what, right? Even if, the next papacy or the one after that tries to, draw back from that change. That change is coming. How it will look for our church is the open question.
Yeah. As we move towards the end here, Dominic, I want to give you a chance to chime in with any thoughts you've been collecting as you've been listening.
I don't actually. I think that we've covered it. I think that the article that you've mentioned that's coming out soon, and how that the additional thing that details that provides, paired with the previous one that you had also posted. Well, I mean, they're excellent. They're also hard to read, and I remember getting to the end of those and just thinking, well, I guess I'm really lucky to have some of those talking points. Like you say, there are some people who are growing up in these cultures and have no capacity or even words for these things, and therefore they don't exist. So I guess the question then, and this is probably where we're going to wrap or start wrapping, is what do you do to help people who aren't familiar or don't have a working knowledge of this? Like, how do you start creating a culture where we do have talking points? Kate, and get, well, what age? Because you mentioned that, I mean, there's children involved with this, and I was stunned. Like this 25-year-old, I think there was a nun in one of the articles you mentioned. You referenced. Now she's struggling with how to respond to this, and I'm scratching my head at well, it's the 2020s, and I would have thought most of us would have a sense of this sort of thing, but there's a lot of us who still don't. So I guess that would be my question is, what's something helpful or proactive, or what do we need to be doing there?
Yeah, good question. Well, it's not.
Solve world hunger, why not?
Yeah. It's not, I'm not going to say, people need to learn the concept of epistemic injustice or, become fluent in the language of institutional vice and plural subjects and so on and so forth. So that's not the answer to the question. I do think, though, that, philosophy has some useful analytical tools that can help people, that have helped me understand a little bit more what's been going on and how this possibly could have happened. There has been, a lot of change for the better, right? So I don't want to say, and this is an important point for you too, Paul, that, sexual abuse is no longer an issue in the church. It is still. At the same time, it's not an issue the way that it was, before the 1990s, it's before the Dallas Charter in 2002. I served my term as a religious ed teacher, did 2 quite difficult years teaching kids preparing for confirmation. And, I underwent some training, right, about sexual abuse and how to spot groomers and so on and so forth. And there was, a class period all about, the sexual abuse scandal within the church. So that was part of the curriculum for these kids. And I think that was a really important moment. It was downplayed a little bit, quite honestly. That seemed to be part of the curriculum. This didn't happen, all that much, and not many priests were involved. And so I thought those defensive moments were maybe unfortunate, but nonetheless, that education was part of preparing these kids who were about to commit themselves to confirmation. So I think there has been, change for the better already. I think it's key, though, that we listen to what children have trouble saying, right? So, part of what it is to be a kid is that you're looking for your voice, and you might not have these concepts to understand what's happened to you, right? And part of the role of an adult there is to listen to children and to hear silences as much as what they're able to articulate. And part of the charge of parents too. Part of the charge of the church is to be frank with children, honest with children in terms that children can hear and make sense of and process. Be honest about the realities of our church and our world, right? So there's still much learning to be done about the sexual abuse scandal. There's much teaching to be done in order to try to protect children.
Yeah, and there is an elegance to the solution to epistemic injustice is truth, is to say more about what's actually true. That's a real element of it, and that helps people be aware of their own experiences. I've found your work helpful for me in understanding my own experience within the church of abusive power and spiritual abuse and different things, and looking at people who I knew who were friends and but why didn't you do the right thing? And asking that question that I think when I read stories from the Pennsylvania grand jury and the McCarrick report, stories still coming out about abuse of power within the church, and there's just this question of, but these aren't cartoon villains. why didn't they do the right thing? When this person was reported, how come the diocese didn't respond in this way? How come the bishop didn't remove this person? How come the religious superior didn't? How come this person didn't? And there's this question of, are all these people evil? Is the institution just full of villains at every turn? Can I not trust anyone? And I found your research to help, to fill out that answer more, where you can have, people who aren't villains, people who aren't overtly malicious. Then this is how they get caught up into participating in these really horrible systemic abuses. And just understanding that, even if there isn't a concrete solution that comes from that, the understanding of it is a step towards a solution. And I found that helpful for articulating my own experience, and I found it helpful to understand other people's experiences as well.
Good to hear. Thank you.
Ending on a practical note, or more of a practical note, do you have any thoughts, maybe speaking personally from your own study with this, on how to examine yourself for ways that, because we all participate in institutions at all different levels, to examine yourself for ways you may be participating in institutional vice, because as you've talked about, sometimes that's really obscure.
Yeah. I thought about that question since you suggested you might answer it. I wish I had a good answer for you. I teach ethics, as we began talking about. And there's this piece by Gordon Marino, philosopher, theologian, student of Soren Kierkegaard, published it in the Chronicle of Higher Education quite a while ago. Anyway, it's very brief, but the title is Before Teaching Ethics, Stop Kidding Yourself. So pay attention as best you can to your patterns of rationalization, of self-deception, your own accommodation of untruths in your life. I'll give you an example. So when you go to the doctor and you're asked, well, how many drinks do you have per week? Are you inclined to choose a lower number than the truth, right? I went after the holidays and found myself inclined to list a lower number perhaps than I should have. Well, that was an interesting moment where there's some truth revealed about yourself that you'd rather not recognize. I think that's probably true of us in a lot of ways, right? But most often we don't take note. But when we can take note, when there are those moments of dissonance, maybe in a difficult conversation with a loved one too, for that matter, I think those are occasions for more general reflection. And the interesting question might be, well, what various untruths am I going along with? What am I letting pass? What am I being willfully ignorant about? What am I winking at? What are the patterns within which I've become habituated? Those moments of insight will not be immediately forthcoming, right? And I think it's more often in conversation with others, especially people who don't have powers within our institutions, that we'd learn about ourselves. At the end of Dan Finn's little article, that common little article on structures of sin, he makes this one suggestion. He says, if you want to increase justice in any group, bring everyone to the table and start by identifying the differing restrictions and opportunities faced by different subgroups. I don't know that, synodality has done that for the church, right? But, if synodality is about, difficult listening, so hearing and maybe hearing truths we sometimes don't want to hear. Yes, we can learn from reflection on ourselves, but we can probably learn a lot more from people who are more marginalized within the institutions where we work, right? And that's difficult for any institution to do, to listen to marginalized people and maybe disgruntled people. But, those are real opportunities for learning. And I can imagine in a parish setting, an exercise like that, might be really, really fruitful. And no doubt in a university setting too.
Yeah. And it lines up very much with the gospel mandate to prioritize the marginalized and the vulnerable, and the church's understanding of this preferential option for the poor. This question of whose voices am I preferring, and am I giving the marginalized and the vulnerable a preference in experiences that I'm hearing.
Yeah, we no doubt know things that people in positions of privilege like me don't know, or maybe don't care to know, for that matter.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, I really appreciated this conversation, and I will keep an eye out for the article when it's published so I can share it. But how can people follow your work? What's the best way for people to connect with you if they'd like?
Connect with me, just send me an email, right, at my John Carroll address. I used to be on Twitter before it became X. I'm not on Twitter any longer. So just reach out to me. I write, frequently for Commonweal. As I said, that's one of my favorite places to publish. I used to host a lot of events online, but that was in my old job. So at this point, best way is just to reach out to me, and I'm happy to have conversations. Happy to learn too from other people.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Wonderful. And friends, if you enjoyed this conversation, hit that like button. It's going to help more people discover the podcast, discover more of Bernard's work. By the way, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to podcasts if you can. That helps more people discover the show as well. Paul, if our friends do have a question or some feedback for this show, where can they go?
Yeah, you can visit me anytime at PopeFrancisGeneration.com. And if you choose to become a paid subscriber, you'll get early access to each episode. And your support helps me take care of a family while I go through school and the different projects that I'm working on.
Yep. And of course, as a paid subscriber, that means you get bragging rights on the first comments. But more importantly, you get to help model the kind of community that Paul is building as more people continue to show up and enjoy these conversations. You can also come and join Paul and myself in Smart Catholics. It's the online community for Catholics who want faithful conversations, kind of like this one, unafraid of doubts and questions. We're building the cutting edge of Catholic social teaching, education, and spirituality today, free of trolls and ads and toxicity. Talk about biting off more than you can chew, but hey, we're giving it a go at smartcatholics.com. Till next time, say a short prayer for yourself and for us. And remember, don't be afraid to ask questions. Doubts can be a sign that we want to know God better and more deeply. God bless.